shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "in mourning will I go down to the grave to my son." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. May God bless to our understanding the reading from His Word. You know, I have an idea. What if we took this story of Joseph and we made it into a musical? Little singing, little dancing, around the story of Joseph, how he's taken to Egypt. And what if we made the king of Egypt like Elvis Presley? What do you think about that idea? And what if it wasn't just Joseph and his coat? What if it was Joseph and his Technicolor dream coat? And the amazing Technicolor dream coat. What do you think? Think it'd fly? That production by Andrew Lloyd Webber, it first came to Broadway in 1982. And it was nominated, didn't win, but nominated for 6 Tony Awards. And it's a good show. And most people associate the Old Testament Joseph with his coat. And for some people, that's all they know about Joseph, what they have gotten from that great musical. The thing is, the Old Testament, the Hebrew text, doesn't necessarily say anything about color in the robe. I know we all have visions of the robe with all those stripes with bright colors, and I don't want to spoil anybody's idea about that, okay? But the idea of the robe having many colors came kind of in a short way when the Hebrews, when the Greeks translated it so they could read the Bible in their language, somehow that got mixed into it. And if you read the Old King James Version, it says a coat of many colors. That's why we think of it like that. But if you notice in the Bible we read from this morning in our pew Bibles, it says it's a richly ornamented robe. And some Bibles will read an ornate robe. Not a colored robe, an ornate robe. And the actual word seems to be that it suggests a very complexly, beautifully embroidered robe. And a robe with long sleeves. That's the point of it. And long sleeves maybe is kind of like long tails on a coat. It's kind of a fancy thing. So let's just call it Joseph and his coat. How about that? Do the next slide for me, Pamela. I think we got another slide. Will you hit that? Let's just call it Joseph and his coat. I want to take out the many colors. Let's be correct. And that's about all I have this morning. So thank you for coming, and I'll see you next Sunday, okay? We're taking these children's stories that we learned in Sunday school that we've kind of made into cute stories, but we want to read them with mature, adult faith now. We've grown up, and there's more to these than maybe we learned as children. And we read about Joseph in Genesis chapters 37 through 50. That's 14 chapters. Now, not all of that is strictly about Joseph, but most of it is. But that's a lot of playtime in Joseph. But is it more about Joseph, this story, or God? The God who's working even when he is hidden? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who can bring good out of evil and turn things that are even bad to serve his purposes in his great providence? it says that Joseph brings a bad report to his father about his brothers. Now, there's a time to tattle and turn the siblings in. I'm not saying there isn't. But there's a time maybe not to. And Joseph seems to be having trouble staying in his own lane. And this is when we are told that Israel, which was the other name for Jacob, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. And that coat was a sign of Joseph being the favorite. Not a great move by Dad, probably. As a result of Jacob's favoritism, Joseph's brothers hate Joseph. Already, we have a problem, and you can just see the therapy bills building up into the future, can't you? Joseph's a dreamer. And the dreamer tells his brothers about the dream of sheaves of grain and how Joseph's sheaf is upright while the brothers' sheaves of grain all bow down to him. And what happens? It says, and the brothers hated him all the more. And Joseph has another dream of a sun and moon and 11 stars, and these are his parents and his brothers. And what do they do in the dream? They bow down to Joseph. Jacob tries to get his son to put a lid on it. And he says, will your mother and I and your brothers actually bow down to you? And that question sets up the latter crux of the story. But again, it says, the brothers' hatred grows. But Jacob, he remembers all these things that are happening. And one day Jacob sends Joseph to check on his brothers who are out grazing their flocks. And when they see him coming, they plot to kill Joseph and get rid of the body, kind of a New Jersey mafia style type of thing. But one of the brothers, Reuben, talks them out of the killing, and he's proposing to just throw him in the cistern with the idea that later Reuben says he could probably come back and get Joseph out and take him back to his father. They see Joseph coming, and he's, of course, wearing his ornate robe, and they strip him of this richly ornate robe, and that's emphasized in the text if you read it. And they throw him in the cistern. The brothers see a caravan of Ishmaelites coming, and they sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, and they take the robe, and they take the blood of a slaughtered animal, and they put it on it. Last Sunday, we had a great morning of Bible trivia over before the service. It was a great morning. So here's a little trivia. What was the goat that was slaughtered? What animal's blood was on the coat that they put on Joseph's coat? What blood? Anybody know? Who said a goat? Very good, Lucas. See, it takes a 9-year-old to do this. Very good. It was a goat. And it's with this coat with blood that they take to Jacob, and it puts him in a horrible grief. The father thinks the dreamer, his favorite son, is dead. The brothers think he's been removed, but things aren't as they seem. The dreamer is very much alive, and he's on his way to the White House in Egypt. And the main character in the story actually isn't Joseph, nor the brothers, nor Jacob. It is the Lord. Even though right now he's silent and he's not visible. But the Lord is moving, as we are going to see later. Now, in just that one chapter of Genesis 37, there is tension, there is violence, there is grief. As one Bible commentator noted, the robe, or that coat, it began in love, then it was torn in deep hate, and then it becomes a tool for deception. Joseph is not dead, but he's also not free. He's in limbo, maybe even in trouble, but God has not abandoned him. And the story goes on, and we're told that the Lord was with Joseph, and he caused Joseph to prosper. And Potiphar, who is one of Pharaoh's high officials, notices Joseph, his skill, and he entrusts Joseph with many responsibilities. But apparently, Joseph was a handsome guy, and Potiphar's wife was rather, I don't know the theological term, but she was rather loose. And she comes on to Joseph, who refuses to betray his trust in Potiphar. But Potiphar's wife lies, and Joseph ends up in prison, as Potiphar thinks that he has tried to seduce his wife. Now, this is important because for 2 full years, Joseph is in an Egyptian prison. There he continues to dream, giving and interpreting dreams to people, to a cupbearer, to a baker who is also in prison with him. 2 years later, Pharaoh has a dream, and no one can interpret it. But the cupbearer, who is now out of prison and remembers his encounter with Joseph in prison, tells Pharaoh, you know, there's a guy in your prison, he can interpret your dream. And so they bring Joseph out. He's brought out of the dungeon. He comes to Pharaoh, and he tells Pharaoh, you know what? I can't interpret the dream, but God can. And 3 times Joseph tells Pharaoh this. He says, I can't interpret the dream, but God can make this known to you. The meaning of Pharaoh's dream is that there will be 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of a famine. Pharaoh sees that Joseph is wise, and he makes him second in command of all of Egypt. And he tells Joseph, you get us ready for this famine. And so Joseph, sure enough, the famine's on its way. Joseph stockpiles the grain while the years are good, and then the famine hits, and things become bad. Jacob hears now, there's grain in Egypt. And he sends his sons to Egypt, where they will end up before Joseph, who again is now second in command in Pharaoh's court. Joseph recognizes them when they come. They do not recognize him. Joseph accuses his brothers of being spies. He plays with them a little bit, and they say, oh, surely not. They deny they're spies. They say, we're just 12 brothers, the youngest who's back with the father and one who is not anymore. The youngest son, Benjamin, who Jacob did not send, is back with the father because he doesn't want to lose his youngest son again like he lost Joseph. Joseph says that to prove that they are telling the truth, they need to leave one brother with him, take some grain back to feed their family, but then come back and bring that younger brother. They leave Simeon as collateral. They go back to Jacob with the grain. As they're traveling back, they open their bags and they see that the silver, which they brought to offer to get some grain, is still in their bags. And they're worried about this because it might look like they have stolen the silver back and they didn't pay for their grain. They tell old Jacob everything that the leader in Egypt told them to do. Bring back Benjamin, but Jacob is loath to do that. And he says this, my son will not go down there with you. His brother is dead. He's the only one left. If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my gray hair down to the grave in sorrow. They've eaten all the grain they brought, and the famine continues. And Jacob wants them to go back and get more food. They remind him that the man in Egypt said, don't come back unless you bring that younger brother. Judah rises and he says he'll take full responsibility for Benjamin. And Jacob finally relents. He also tells them to bring some items of value with them, some spices and things, to this leader in Egypt. You still with me? It's a long story. They go back. They present themselves to Joseph, who sees Benjamin. They explain to Joseph's steward about the silver in their bags and how they didn't know about it, and they're worried. And to their surprise, the steward says he's aware of it because they put it back in the bags. What they thought was God punishing them was actually a non-issue, God working for them. Well, Joseph has a big meal prepared for his brothers and this younger brother. And he asks his brother about, even though they still don't recognize him, he says, tell me about your father. Joseph is so moved from seeing young Benjamin that he excuses himself to a private place and he weeps. He composes himself. He comes back and they enjoy the feast. The next morning, Joseph gives instructions to load the brothers' sacks with grain, but he tells his steward, put my silver drinking cup in the bag of the youngest, Benjamin. He sends them off, and then he tells the steward, you go catch them, and you have them all open their bags. And when you find the cup, accuse them of stealing the cup. Well, the steward catches up to the brothers, saying that the cup is missing. The brothers deny they took anything. They open their sacks, and the steward finds the silver chalice in Benjamin's bag. And he had told them, if we find it in anybody's bag, that person will be brought back to Egypt and made a slave. Well, it's in Benjamin's sack. And remember how Jacob just couldn't handle losing Benjamin. They're taken back to Joseph, who accuses them of this crime. And Judah explains the entire situation and how precious Benjamin is to their father, and how the father has already lost a treasured son. And Judah asks that he be kept while Benjamin be allowed to go free. And chapter 45 begins this way. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave in my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is your father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer because they were terrified in his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. And when they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Joseph recounts to his brothers all that happened to him after they sold him away, and Joseph tells them, it was God who sent him ahead of them. 3 times it says, it was God who brought him where he was today. And Joseph tells his brothers to go find their father and his father and come and live in Egypt. And when they tell Jacob that Joseph is alive, it says he is stunned. The family comes to Egypt. They're provided for by Pharaoh. Jacob becomes ill and he dies, and when he dies, the brothers now fear that Joseph has just been holding back his vengeance because of Jacob, and now that Jacob is gone, maybe they're done for. They tell Joseph, they said, Jacob, your father, he had one wish before he died, and it was this, that Joseph forgive his brothers on Jacob's account for what they did to him when they stripped him of his coat, threw him into the cistern, and sold him away. Kind of a father's last wish. And it says, when their message came to him, again, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. You intended it for harm, but God intended it for good. You see, though the brothers planned to eliminate Joseph right from the beginning, there was another plan at work. It was God's plan. Because in the long run, God intended for Jacob and his family to be brought to a good place in Egypt, and nothing in the plan of the brothers or Pharaoh or anyone else could keep this from happening. So what's this all about? It's about the movement of God in everyday lives of human beings, especially when it looks like God has left the building. Don't we ever feel like that? Things are just going so bad. There are so many trials in our lives that God's not with me. This story is realistic because the world, our lives are full of uncertainty and problems. But this story is also assuring that despite all the uncertainty and the problems, God is faithful and He will get the outcome that He determines. God doesn't always move as fast as we like, does He? It takes 13 years for Joseph to become second in command in Egypt. God doesn't always work like we think. But this is about God's sovereignty. And when we talk about God's sovereignty, what we mean is that He rules over and controls all things. It means we belong, body and soul, in life and in death, to God in such a way that all things must work together for our good and for our salvation before God. That doesn't mean we always see it or feel it. It doesn't mean that God rubber stamps everything that hits our lives. It doesn't mean that we will even get to see how it all is supposed to work in our lifetime. It simply means Almighty God can bring good out of evil. In faith, we stand that nothing can outdo God. Paul says this in Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. And God's biggest statement on this was His vindication of the cross of the Lord Jesus Christ. For the plots of humans can only ultimately serve the purposes of God. We see again and again in Joseph's life how choices made by various people are meant to lead to destruction, yet God works His purposes. Someone said the evil plans of human folks do not defeat God's purpose. Instead, they unwittingly become ways in which God's plan is furthered. God didn't approve of Joseph's brothers' original plan against him and what they did to him. They were fully responsible for their crime. God did not make them do it. He did not need their cruelty to accomplish His plan, but whatever would happen, God was going to get Joseph to Egypt and come to a place where God's blessing and deliverance would come through him. And it is in Egypt that the larger story of God's people begins to take place, bringing them out of that place to a place of fruition. And from those people, of course, comes the Messiah, Jesus. So Joseph isn't so much about a coat as his story is about comfort. The comfort that comes from knowing that God is present, that God has us, and that nothing can stop His purposes for us or in this world. Let's pray.